Officer Jack, driven by his deep-seated prejudices, arrests an old black woman named Ella. But his confidence shatters moments later when he learns she's not just anyone. She's his new boss. As his entire world begins to unravel, will he confront the prejudices that have shaped his life or continue down the same path? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer Jack Wilson cruised down the pristine streets of Oakwood Heights, his eyes scanning the sidewalks with a mixture of boredom and contempt. The sun glinted off the polished storefronts, casting a warm glow on the well-dressed shoppers bustling in and out of designer boutiques and gourmet cafes. Jack's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he watched a group of teenagers exit a high-end electronics store, their laughter echoing across the street. He shook his head, a scowl etching deeper lines into his already stern face. "Look at them," he muttered to himself. "Probably never worked a day in their lives." As he turned onto Maple Avenue, Jack's gaze fell on a young woman struggling with several shopping bags. Her designer sunglasses perched atop her perfectly styled hair, and a sparkling diamond necklace adorned her neck. Jack's lips curled into a sneer. "Another day, another trust fund baby," he thought bitterly. "Must be nice to have mommy and daddy's credit card." Jack had been patrolling these streets for over 2 decades, and each passing year seemed to deepen his resentment. He'd grown up on the other side of town, where life wasn't served on a silver platter. The stark contrast between his upbringing and the opulence surrounding him now only fueled his cynicism. As he waited at a red light, Jack noticed a man in tattered clothes shuffling along the sidewalk. The man's presence stood out like a sore thumb amidst the manicured lawns and luxury cars. Jack's eyes narrowed as he watched the passers-by give the man a wide berth, their faces a mix of disgust and fear. He doesn't belong here, Jack thought, his jaw clenching. Why can't he stay in his own neighborhood? The light turned green and Jack accelerated, leaving the homeless man behind. But the image lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the divide that existed in their town. As he continued his patrol, Jack's internal dialogue became a constant stream of judgment and disdain. Every person he saw became a target for his prejudices. The young mother pushing an expensive stroller, the businessman in his tailored suit, the group of college students laughing outside a trendy coffee shop. They have no idea what real life is like, Jack thought, a sense of superiority washing over him. Living in their little bubble, thinking they're better than everyone else. Jack's radio crackled to life, breaking through his bitter musings. A shoplifting incident had been reported at one of the boutiques. As he turned his cruiser around to respond, a small part of him felt a twisted satisfaction. Finally, he thought, a chance to show these people that their money can't protect them from everything. On a dreary afternoon, the sky opened up, unleashing a steady downpour that drummed against the roof of Jack's patrol car. The wipers squeaked rhythmically as they fought against the rain, matching the grumbling tone of Jack's thoughts. His radio crackled to life, cutting through the monotonous sound of raindrops. "All units, we have a report of a suspicious individual at Oakwood Mall. Possible shoplifting in progress." Jack's lips curled into a smirk. "Bet I know exactly what kind of suspicious individual we're dealing with," he muttered, flicking on his sirens. As he pulled into the mall parking lot, Jack's mind was already made up about who he'd find. He'd seen it 100 times before. Young punks trying to make a quick buck, or addicts desperate for their next fix. The faces changed, but to Jack, they were all the same. He stepped out of his car, the rain immediately soaking through his uniform. Jack's eyes scanned the area, finally settling on a figure near the entrance of Lux, one of the mall's most expensive stores. To his surprise, it wasn't a teenager in baggy clothes or a twitchy addict he saw. Instead, an elderly black woman stood quietly by the store's window, her gray hair neatly tucked under a plastic rain bonnet. She clutched a worn purse close to her chest, eyes fixed on the dazzling display of jewelry in the window. Jack's prejudices kicked into overdrive. His eyes narrowed as he watched her, suspicion clouding his judgment. "What's she doing here?" he thought. "She doesn't belong in a place like this." Without hesitation, Jack strode towards the woman, his hand instinctively resting on his holster. As he approached, the woman turned, her eyes widening at the sight of the uniformed officer bearing down on her. "Ma'am," Jack barked, his voice gruff and authoritative, "I'm going to need you to step away from the store." The elderly woman looked confused, her weathered hands gripping her purse tighter. "I'm sorry, officer," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "Have I done something wrong?" Jack's jaw clenched. In his mind, her innocent act was just that, an act. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said, taking another step closer. "What's your business here?" The woman's eyes darted nervously between Jack and the store entrance. I was just looking," she stammered. "My granddaughter's birthday is coming up, and I thought—" "Sure you were," Jack interrupted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Why don't you empty out that purse for me?" As Jack's demands grew more insistent, a small crowd began to gather. Shoppers whispered among themselves, some shooting concerned glances at the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each passing moment. Jack's face hardened as he stared down at the elderly woman. "I'll ask you one more time," he growled. "What's your business here?" The woman took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening despite her small frame. "My name is Ella Moore," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm simply waiting for my ride, officer." Jack scoffed, his disbelief evident in every line of his face. "Waiting for a ride? In front of the most expensive store in the mall? That's quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Ella's eyes met Jack's, unflinching. "It's where my grandson said he'd pick me up. I don't see how that's a problem." By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. Shoppers slowed their pace, watching the scene with a mix of curiosity and concern. Jack could feel their eyes on him, but it only made him more determined. "You're loitering," he declared, his voice rising. "This is private property. You can't just hang around here all day." "I've only been here for 10 minutes, Ella replied, her composure never wavering. "And I'm not bothering anyone." Jack's frustration grew with each of Ella's calm responses. He took a step closer, towering over her. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he demanded. Ella shook her head slightly. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I'm required to show you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jack's face flushed red, anger bubbling up inside him. He was used to people cowering when he flexed his authority, not standing up to him. "Listen here," he snarled, jabbing a finger towards Ella. "I'm the law around here, and when I ask for ID, you show it, unless you've got something to hide." Ella remained steady, her voice level as she replied, "I have nothing to hide, officer, but I also know my rights. Unless you're arresting me, I'm not obligated to show you my identification." Jack's hand instinctively moved to his belt, fingers brushing against his handcuffs. The crowd tensed, several onlookers pulling out their phones. "You people always think you know better," Jack spat out, his prejudices on full display. "Always causing trouble, never respecting authority." Ella's eyes widened slightly at Jack's words, but she held her ground. "Officer," she said softly, "I think you might want to reconsider your approach here." Jack's patience wore thin as Ella continued to stand her ground. His face contorted with anger, and his voice rose to a shout. "That's it. I've had enough of your attitude. You're under arrest for trespassing and resisting authority." Before Ella could respond, Jack roughly grabbed her arm and spun her around. The crowd gasped as he yanked her wrists behind her back, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking into place. "You people never learn," Jack sneered, his prejudice on full display. "This isn't your part of town. You don't belong here." Ella winced as the cuffs bit into her skin, but she held her head high. "Officer, please," she said softly. "This isn't right, and you know it." Jack ignored her plea, instead pushing her forward towards the mall exit. "Maybe a night in jail will teach you some respect," he growled. As they walked, Jack continued his tirade. "I'm sick of you troublemakers coming to our nice neighborhoods, thinking you can do whatever you want. It's time you learned your place." Ella's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "My place, officer, is wherever I choose to be, just like any other citizen." The crowd followed them, many with phones out recording the scene. Whispers of shock and outrage rippled through the onlookers. Some called out in protest, but Jack paid them no mind. As they reached the police cruiser, Jack roughly guided Ella into the back seat. He leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. "Let's see how smart you are when you're explaining this to the judge." Ella looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I pray you'll see the error of your ways someday, officer," she said quietly. Jack slammed the door shut, cutting off any further conversation. He turned to face the crowd, his hand resting on his weapon. "Show's over, folks. Move along now." As he climbed into the driver's seat, Jack caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face, but he quickly pushed it aside. He was just doing his job, he told himself, keeping the streets safe. That's what mattered. With a final glare at the dispersing crowd, Jack started the engine and pulled away from the curb, Ella sitting silently in the back. Jack marched into the police station, his hand firmly gripping Ella's arm. A smug smile played on his lips as he guided her through the bustling precinct. Officers glanced up from their desks, but quickly returned to their work, paying little attention to the scene unfolding before them. "All right, Moore," Jack said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Time to get you processed." He led Ella to a nearby bench and roughly sat her down. "Stay put," he ordered, before striding over to the booking desk. As Jack began filling out the paperwork, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. In his mind, he was doing his job, keeping the streets safe from people who didn't belong. He scribbled away, occasionally throwing a glance at Ella, who sat quietly with her head held high. "What have you got there, Wilson?" asked Officer Thompson, peering over Jack's shoulder. "Just another troublemaker thinking they can do whatever they want," Jack replied, not looking up from his forms. "Caught her loitering at the mall, giving me attitude." Thompson shrugged, clearly uninterested. "Well, you know best," he said, before wandering off to refill his coffee mug. The indifference of his colleagues only reinforced Jack's belief that he was in the right. No one questioned his judgment or actions. He was a respected officer after all. As Jack was finishing up the paperwork, the station's atmosphere suddenly shifted. Captain Roberts burst out of his office, his face etched with concern. He scanned the room frantically before his eyes landed on Jack and Ella. "Wilson!" the captain barked, striding towards them with purpose. "My office, now!" Jack's smug expression faltered for a moment. He glanced at Ella, who remained calm and composed, then back at the captain. Something in the older man's tone made Jack's stomach tighten with unease. "Sir?" Jack asked, confusion evident in his voice. "I was just booking this woman for—" "Now, Wilson!" Captain Roberts cut him off, his voice leaving no room for argument. The other officers in the station had stopped what they were doing, all eyes now on Jack and the captain. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack slowly set down his pen and followed his superior to the office. As the door closed behind them, a hush fell over the precinct. Something big was happening, and everyone could sense it. The once indifferent officers now exchanged worried glances, their curiosity piqued by the captain's unusual behavior. As the door to Captain Roberts' office closed, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The captain's face was a mix of anger and disappointment as he turned to face Jack. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Wilson?" Captain Roberts asked, his voice low and controlled. Jack swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just doing my job. That woman was—" "That woman," the captain interrupted, "is Ella Moore, the newly appointed director of the city's Police Oversight Committee." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face as the gravity of the situation sank in. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "She has authority over our entire department, including you and me," Captain Roberts continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "And you just arrested her for loitering at a mall." Jack's legs felt weak. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. I didn't know," he stammered. "Of course you didn't know," the captain exploded. "Because you didn't bother to find out. You saw an elderly black woman and immediately assumed she was up to no good. The captain's words stung, but Jack knew they were true. He had let his prejudices guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. Outside the office, word had spread quickly. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering and casting glances at the closed door. When it finally opened, all eyes turned to Jack as he stepped out, his face ashen and his shoulders slumped. Ella Moore stood from the bench, her dignity intact despite the handcuffs still on her wrists. The room fell silent as she walked towards Jack, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Officer Wilson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe these belong to you." She held out her hands, waiting for him to remove the cuffs. With trembling fingers, Jack fumbled with the keys. As the cuffs fell away, he couldn't bring himself to look Ella in the eye. Shame washed over him in waves. I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ella rubbed her wrists, her gaze never leaving Jack's face. "Your apology is noted, Officer Wilson," she said. "But it's going to take more than words to address the systemic issues that led to this incident." The other officers watched in stunned silence, the reality of Jack's mistake sinking in. His future in the department, once so secure, now hung by a thread. Ella took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room full of officers. Despite the humiliation she had endured, she stood tall, her dignity unshaken. The police chief, a man named Johnson, approached her with an apologetic expression. "Ms. Moore, I can't begin to express how sorry we are for this incident," Chief Johnson said, his voice laced with concern. "We'll take whatever action you deem necessary." Ella nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you, Chief Johnson. I appreciate your concern." She paused, considering her words carefully. "I won't be pressing charges against Officer Wilson." A collective sigh of relief echoed through the room. Jack's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his face remained tense. "However," Ella continued, her voice firm, "I do have a request. I'd like Officer Wilson to attend diversity training and participate in community outreach programs." Chief Johnson nodded eagerly. "Of course, Ms. Moore, we'll make sure it happens." Jack's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp look from the chief silenced him. Ella turned to face Jack directly. "Officer Wilson, this isn't about punishment. It's about growth and understanding. I believe you have the potential to become a better officer and a better person." Jack clenched his jaw, his face flushing with a mix of shame and anger. He felt cornered, trapped by his own actions and the mercy of a woman he had wronged. The thought of attending these programs filled him with resentment, but he knew he had no choice. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered through gritted teeth, unable to meet Ella's eyes. Chief Johnson stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You'll start next week, Wilson. This is non-negotiable." As the reality of his situation sank in, Jack felt a storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on knowing right from wrong. Now he was being told he needed to change, to learn. The internal battle had already begun. Ella gathered her belongings, preparing to leave. Before she walked out, she turned back to the room full of officers. "I look forward to working with all of you to create positive change in our community," she said, her voice filled with hope and determination. As the door closed behind her, Jack stood frozen, the weight of his actions and the journey ahead pressing down on him. The central conflict was set. Jack would have to confront his biases and prejudices whether he wanted to or not. After the following week, Jack slouched in his chair, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The community center's meeting room buzzed with chatter, but he remained silent, his face set in a scowl. This was the last place he wanted to be on a Tuesday evening. "Welcome, everyone," a cheerful voice called out. "I'm Tina, and I'll be leading our diversity training sessions." Jack rolled his eyes. Tina, a young woman with a bright smile, stood at the front of the room. Her enthusiasm only irritated him more. "Let's go around and introduce ourselves," Tina suggested. As people began to share their names and backgrounds, Jack's mind wandered. He didn't care about these people or their stories. To him, this was just a punishment, a waste of time. "And you, sir?" Tina's voice snapped Jack back to reality. "Jack Wilson," he muttered. "Police officer." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jack noticed their reactions and felt a twinge of satisfaction. At least he still had some authority here. Tina nodded, her smile never faltering. "Thank you, Jack. Now let's begin with some personal stories. Who would like to share an experience of discrimination they've faced?" A middle-aged man raised his hand. "I'm Miguel," he began. "Last month I was followed around a store by security. They thought I was stealing just because of how I look." Jack fought the urge to roll his eyes again. He'd heard stories like this before and didn't believe half of them. More people shared their experiences. A young woman talked about being passed over for promotions. An elderly gentleman described being treated rudely at a restaurant. As the stories continued, Jack found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. He didn't want to hear these things. He didn't want to think about how his actions might have affected people like those in this room. "Jack," Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. "What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?" Jack straightened in his chair, caught off guard. Well, it's unfortunate," he said stiffly. "But sometimes people misinterpret situations." A tense silence fell over the room. Jack could feel disapproving eyes on him, but he refused to back down. He was here because he had to be, not because he wanted to change. As the session continued, Jack remained distant, barely participating. He counted down the minutes until he could leave, already dreading the next meeting. The following Saturday, Jack found himself standing awkwardly in the bustling community center. Colorful posters adorned the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air. He felt out of place, like a fish out of water. Ella Moore walked in, her presence commanding attention without effort. She smiled warmly at everyone, including Jack, who couldn't help but avert his gaze. "Good morning, everyone," Ella said, her voice clear and confident. "Today, we're going to focus on building bridges in our community." Jack shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could be anywhere else. He watched as Ella effortlessly engaged with people from all walks of life, young, old, different races and backgrounds. Her genuine interest in their stories was evident. "Jack," Ella called out, "would you mind helping Mrs. Thompson with her craft project?" Reluctantly, Jack made his way to an elderly woman struggling with scissors. As he assisted her, he couldn't help but notice the gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, young man," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "These old hands aren't what they used to be." Jack nodded, a small crack appearing in his usual stern expression. Throughout the day, Ella guided various activities, always finding ways to include Jack. He helped serve lunch, participated in a group discussion, and even played a game with some of the children. As Jack watched Ella interact with a group of teenagers, he felt a strange sensation. Her words were kind but firm, her guidance clear and respectful. It reminded him of someone, but he couldn't quite place it. "You know," a voice beside him said, "she reminds me of my grandmother." Jack turned to see Miguel, the man from his diversity training session. "Always patient, always willing to teach," Miguel continued, "even when people didn't want to learn." Jack remained silent, but something in Miguel's words struck a chord. He found himself observing Ella more closely, noticing the way she listened intently to everyone, the way she made each person feel valued. As the day wound down, Jack helped clean up, surprising himself with his willingness to stay. Ella approached him, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you for your help today, Jack," she said sincerely. "I hope you found it as rewarding as I did." Jack mumbled a response, not quite ready to admit that the day hadn't been as terrible as he'd expected. As he walked to his car, he felt a subtle shift within himself. The community center, which had seemed so foreign this morning, now felt a little less intimidating. The following week, Jack found himself back at the community center, this time for a food drive organized by Ella. The large room buzzed with activity as volunteers scurried about, sorting canned goods and packing boxes. Jack stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Ella moved through the crowd with purpose, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the bustling energy around her. She stopped to chat with each volunteer, offering words of encouragement and guidance. Jack couldn't help but notice how people's faces lit up when she approached. "Excuse me, Ms. Moore?" A young boy tugged at Ella's sleeve. "Where should I put these cereal boxes?" Ella knelt down to the boy's level, her eyes twinkling. "Great question, Tommy. Why don't you help me set up a new station for breakfast items?" Jack watched as Ella guided Tommy to an empty table, patiently showing him how to arrange the boxes. The boy beamed with pride at his newfound responsibility. As the day progressed, Jack found himself drawn into the action, albeit reluctantly. He helped carry heavy boxes and organize supplies, all while keeping a watchful eye on Ella. He couldn't deny the efficiency with which she ran the operation, nor the respect she commanded from everyone present. During a lull in activity, Jack overheard a conversation between Ella and an elderly woman. "Ms. Moore, I can't thank you enough for organizing this," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Times have been tough since I lost my job, and this food drive, it's a real blessing." Ella placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "That's what community is all about, Margaret. We look out for each other. And please remember the job training program we discussed. I believe in you." Jack felt an unexpected twinge in his chest. He'd never considered the personal stories behind the faces he'd so often dismissed. Ella's genuine care for each individual was admirable. As the day wore on, Jack found himself grudgingly impressed by Ella's leadership. She seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to motivate people to do it. It was a far cry from the stern, authoritarian approach he was used to. Yet even as he felt a glimmer of respect for Ella, Jack clung stubbornly to his old beliefs. He tried to shake off the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about some things. It was easier to hold on to his familiar worldview than to admit he might have misjudged people like Ella. As the food drive wound down, Jack caught himself almost smiling at the sight of the packed boxes ready for distribution. He quickly schooled his features back into a neutral expression, but not before Ella noticed. "It's quite something, isn't it?" she said, coming to stand beside him. "What we can accomplish when we work together." Jack grunted non-committally, unwilling to agree out loud. But as he looked around at the tired but satisfied volunteers, he couldn't deny the impact of the day's work. His certainty in his old beliefs had developed a tiny crack, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge it just yet. The following week, Jack found himself on patrol near a busy shopping district. As he walked down the street, his eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble, he spotted a commotion outside a convenience store. A young black boy, no older than 12, was being forcefully held by the store owner, while a small crowd gathered around. Jack's first instinct was to assume the worst. He quickened his pace, ready to intervene, when he saw a familiar figure approaching from the opposite direction. It was Ella Moore, her calm presence immediately noticeable even from a distance. As Jack drew closer, he could hear the store owner's angry voice. "I saw him slip that candy bar into his pocket. He's a thief." The boy, tears streaming down his face, shook his head frantically. "I didn't. I swear I didn't take anything." Ella reached the scene just moments before Jack. She placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and addressed the store owner with a firm but respectful tone. "Sir, please let go of the child. We can sort this out without physical force." The store owner reluctantly released his grip, and Ella knelt down to the boy's eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Marcus," the boy sniffled, wiping his eyes. "Marcus, can you empty your pockets for me?" Ella asked softly. With shaking hands, Marcus turned out his pockets. They were empty. Jack watched, a strange feeling growing in his chest as Ella stood up and faced the store owner. "Sir, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. Marcus doesn't have any stolen goods on him." The store owner sputtered, his face red with embarrassment and lingering anger. "But I saw him. I was sure." Ella's voice remained calm but carried an undeniable authority. "We all make mistakes sometimes. What's important is how we handle them. Perhaps we could review the security footage to clear things up." As the situation de-escalated, Jack couldn't help but remember his own encounter with Ella at the mall. The parallels were undeniable. A black person wrongly accused, treated with suspicion and aggression based on nothing but prejudice. For the first time, Jack felt a wave of genuine guilt wash over him. He saw himself in the store owner's actions, in the quick judgment and unfounded accusation. The shame he felt was no longer about being caught or facing consequences. It was a deep, personal realization of the harm his actions could cause. As Ella comforted Marcus and spoke quietly with his mother, who had arrived at the scene, Jack stood rooted to the spot. He watched Ella handle the situation with grace, empathy, and unwavering strength. It was a stark contrast to his own approach, and he couldn't deny the effectiveness of her methods. In that moment, something shifted within Jack. The wall of prejudice and stubbornness that he had built over years began to crumble. He realized that his actions, which he had always justified as just doing his job, could have devastating consequences on innocent lives. As the weeks passed, Jack found himself attending the diversity training sessions with less resistance. Though he still felt out of place, he began to pay more attention to the stories shared by community members. Their experiences, once dismissed as exaggerations, now resonated with him in ways he couldn't ignore. One afternoon during a group discussion, Jack surprised himself by raising his hand. I've been thinking about something, he said hesitantly. Maybe there's more to these situations than I used to believe. The room fell silent, all eyes on Jack. Ella, who was facilitating the session, nodded encouragingly. Go on, Officer Wilson. We're listening. Jack took a deep breath. I've seen things on the job that I thought were clear-cut, but now I'm starting to wonder if I missed important details because of how I saw things. As he spoke, Jack noticed Ella's expression. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding that made him feel both uncomfortable and oddly relieved. After the session, Jack lingered behind, helping to stack chairs. Ella approached him, a gentle smile on her face. Thank you for sharing today, Officer Wilson. It takes courage to question our own perspectives. Jack nodded, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Ms. Moore, I appreciate how you've handled all this. You've been professional and kind, even after... He trailed off, unable to directly address their first encounter. Ella seemed to understand. We're all here to learn and grow, Officer Wilson. That includes me. For the first time since the training began, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could change. Maybe it wasn't too late to see the world differently. As they walked out of the community center together, a tentative rapport began to form between them. Jack found himself asking Ella about her experiences leading the police oversight committee. She shared insights that challenged his long-held beliefs about law enforcement and community relations. Though their conversations were still guarded, Jack sensed a fragile connection forming. He realized that Ella's kindness and professionalism, despite their rocky start, was teaching him more than any formal training session could. As Jack left the community center one evening, feeling a sense of progress he hadn't expected, he spotted a familiar face in the parking lot. It was Mike, his old patrol partner and longtime friend. Well, if it isn't Jack Wilson, Mike called out, a smirk on his face. I heard you've been spending a lot of time here lately. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. Hey, Mike, yeah, I've been attending some programs. Mike's smirk turned into a sneer. Programs? Is that what they're calling it now? Looks more like brainwashing to me. Jack shifted uncomfortably. It's not like that. I'm just learning some new perspectives. Mike stepped closer, his voice lowering. New perspectives? Come on, Jack. We both know what's really going on here. You're going soft. The accusation stung more than Jack expected. I'm not going soft, he defended. I'm just trying to do my job better. Mike scoffed. Better? By what standard? The bleeding hearts who think we're all corrupt? The people who've never walked a beat in their lives? Jack felt his resolve wavering. Mike's words echoed the thoughts he'd been trying to push away. Remember who we are, Jack, Mike continued, his tone serious. We're the thin blue line. We're the ones who keep order in this city. Don't let them make you forget that. Jack's mind raced. He thought of Ella, of the stories he'd heard in the training sessions, but he also remembered the camaraderie he'd shared with Mike, the sense of purpose they'd felt as officers. I haven't forgotten, Jack said, his voice uncertain. I'm still a cop. Mike nodded, a look of approval crossing his face. Good. Don't let them change you, Jack. We need guys like you out there, guys who understand how things really work. As Mike walked away, Jack stood frozen in the parking lot. The progress he'd felt earlier seemed to crumble around him. Doubt crept into his mind, challenging the new perspectives he'd been considering. Jack got into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He felt torn between two worlds, the familiar comfort of his old beliefs and the unfamiliar territory of change. As he drove home, Mike's words echoed in his head, planting seeds of doubt that threatened to undo everything he'd learned in the past weeks. Jack's encounter with Mike left him shaken to his core. The following days saw him withdrawing from the community work he'd reluctantly begun to embrace. He started showing up late to sessions, his participation becoming minimal and half-hearted. Ella noticed the change in Jack's demeanor. His eyes, which had started to show a glimmer of understanding, now held a guarded look. She watched as he distanced himself from the group, choosing to sit alone and avoid conversation. During a community outreach event at the local park, Jack stood off to the side, arms crossed. Ella approached him, her face etched with concern. "Jack, is everything all right?" she asked gently. "You've seemed different lately." Jack tensed up, his defenses rising. "I'm fine," he replied curtly. "Just doing what I have to do to get through this." Ella sighed. "I thought we were making progress. You seem to be opening up to new ideas." Something in Jack snapped. The doubt that had been gnawing at him since his talk with Mike burst forth. "New ideas?" he scoffed. "You mean learning how to be soft on crime? How to let people walk all over us?" Ella's eyes widened in surprise. "That's not what this is about, Jack. It's about understanding and serving our community better." Jack's face hardened. "Our community? You mean your community? Some of us still remember what it means to be a real cop." The words hung in the air, sharp and hurtful. Ella's face fell, disappointment clear in her eyes. But true to her nature, she didn't lash out. Instead, she took a deep breath, her composure unwavering. "I see," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Jack." Without another word, Ella turned and walked away, leaving Jack alone with his rekindled prejudices and the weight of his hurtful words. Jack stood rooted to the spot, watching Ella's retreating figure. The weight of his words crashed down on him, leaving him feeling hollow and ashamed. He ran a hand through his hair, his face twisted with regret. "What have I done?" he muttered to himself. For the rest of the event, Jack kept to himself, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He couldn't bear to see the disappointment in Ella's eyes or the wary glances from the other volunteers. As soon as he could, he slipped away, driving home in a daze. Over the next few days, Jack isolated himself. He called in sick to work, unable to face his colleagues or the community he'd been working with. His apartment became his refuge and his prison. Empty takeout containers piled up on the coffee table as he spent hours staring blankly at the TV, not really seeing or hearing anything. Thoughts swirled in his mind, a constant battle between his old beliefs and the new perspectives he'd been exposed to. He kept replaying his conversation with Mike, then his harsh words to Ella. The conflict tore at him, leaving him feeling lost and confused. One afternoon, Jack found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He hardly recognized the man looking back at him. Unshaven, eyes bloodshot, a shell of his former self. "Who are you?" he asked his reflection. "Are you the tough cop who doesn't take any crap? Or are you something else?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Jack slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold tile floor. He buried his face in his hands, feeling utterly defeated. "Maybe I can't change," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Maybe this is just who I am." The thought terrified him. For the first time, Jack realized he didn't want to be that person anymore. But the path to change seemed impossible, especially after pushing away the one person who believed he could be better. As night fell, Jack sat in the darkness of his living room, feeling more lost and alone than ever before. The city lights twinkled outside his window, a world moving on without him. He was at a crossroads, unsure if he had the strength or the ability to become the person he now wanted to be. As the days passed, Jack's guilt grew heavier, weighing on him like a physical burden. He sat on his worn couch, surrounded by the mess of his apartment, his mind replaying every moment of his time with Ella and the community. He thought about the food drive where he'd seen Ella's leadership in action. He remembered the young boys she'd defended and how she'd shown such grace under pressure. Jack's chest tightened as he recalled the kindness in her eyes, even when she looked at him, the man who had wrongly arrested her. "She never held it against me," Jack muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ella had given him a chance to be better, to learn and grow, and he'd thrown it all away with one thoughtless comment. Jack stood up, pacing his small living room. He ran his hands through his hair, feeling a mix of shame and admiration. Ella's strength, her unwavering commitment to justice and compassion, had touched something deep inside him. He'd grown to respect her more than he'd ever respected anyone before. "I can't let it end like this," he said to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. But as soon as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. How could he possibly make things right? What could he say to Ella that would undo the hurt he'd caused? Jack's shoulders slumped as he sank back onto the couch. He wanted to apologize, to tell Ella how much he'd learned from her. He wanted to explain how she'd opened his eyes to a world he'd been too blind to see before. But the thought of facing her, of seeing the disappointment in her eyes, made his stomach churn. Jack picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Ella's contact. He'd gotten her number during the community outreach program. Now, it felt like a lifeline he didn't deserve to grab. "Come on, Jack," he urged himself. "You've got to try." But his finger wouldn't move. The fear of rejection, of confirming that he truly couldn't change, paralyzed him. Jack set the phone down, burying his face in his hands. He knew he needed to make amends, but he had no idea how to begin. The path forward seemed impossible, yet the thought of giving up and returning to his old ways felt even worse. As the sun rose on a crisp autumn morning, Ella Moore sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her phone. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then dialed Jack's number. Jack was startled by the ringtone, his heart racing as he saw Ella's name on the screen. He hesitated, almost letting it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good morning, Jack." Ella's warm voice came through the line. "I hope I'm not calling too early." Jack swallowed hard. "No, not at all. I'm surprised to hear from you." Ella's voice remained gentle. "Jack, I know things have been difficult lately, but I wanted to invite you to our annual fundraiser for the community center this Saturday. It's a big event, and I think it would be good for you to be there." Jack's mind raced. He felt a mix of relief that Ella was reaching out and fear of facing her and the community again. I don't know if that's a good idea, Ella. After what I said." "We all make mistakes, Jack," Ella interrupted softly. "What matters is how we choose to move forward. This could be a chance for you to reconnect with the community and maybe find some healing." Jack felt a lump forming in his throat. Ella's kindness, her willingness to give him another chance, touched him deeply. He knew he didn't deserve it, but he also knew he couldn't waste this opportunity. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there." "I'm glad to hear that, Jack," Ella replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I'll see you Saturday." As Jack hung up the phone, he felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Gratitude for Ella's forgiveness, anxiety about facing the community, and a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The days leading up to the fundraiser passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Jack found himself standing outside the community center on Saturday evening, his palms sweaty and his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room was filled with laughter, music, and the buzz of conversation. Jack felt overwhelmed, out of place in this vibrant gathering. He scanned the crowd, looking for a familiar face. Then he saw her. Ella stood across the room, radiant in a simple blue dress, talking animatedly with a group of people. As if sensing his presence, she looked up and met his eyes. Her smile was warm and welcoming as she excused herself and made her way over to him. "Jack," she said, reaching out to touch his arm gently. "I'm so glad you came." Jack stood at the edge of the bustling room, feeling like a fish out of water. The community center was alive with energy, laughter echoing off the walls as people mingled and chatted. He watched as Ella moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting everyone with a warm smile and a kind word. As he observed, Jack noticed how people's faces lit up when Ella approached. Children ran up to hug her, and adults clasped her hands with genuine affection. It was clear that Ella was more than just a community leader. She was a beloved friend to many. Jack's attention was drawn to a small group gathered near the refreshment table. An elderly woman was speaking, her eyes shining with emotion. "I don't know where I'd be without Miss Ella," she said, her voice quavering. "When I lost my job and couldn't pay rent, she helped me find resources and even pitched in herself to keep me off the streets." Others in the group nodded in agreement, each with their own story to share. Jack listened, his heart growing heavier with each tale of Ella's kindness and generosity. A young man spoke up next, his voice filled with gratitude. "Miss Ella believed in me when no one else did. She helped me get into college, even tutored me herself. Now, I'm the first in my family to graduate." As the stories continued, Jack felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He remembered his harsh words, his unfair judgments, and the way he had treated Ella when they first met. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of people whose lives Ella had touched. These were the same people he had dismissed, the community he had deemed unworthy of his respect. Jack realized with a pang of regret that his behavior hadn't just hurt Ella. It had affected every person in this room. The laughter and joy surrounding him felt like a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. Jack stood there, invisible to the celebrating crowd, wrestling with the full impact of his prejudices and actions. As the fundraiser wound down, Jack found himself lingering in the community center. The crowd had thinned, leaving behind a quiet hum of conversation and the soft clink of dishes being cleared away. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Ella. He spotted her near the back, helping to stack chairs. Taking a deep breath, Jack made his way over, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, Ella looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "Miss Moore," Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Could I talk to you for a moment?" Ella nodded, setting down the chair she was holding. "Of course, Officer Wilson. What's on your mind?" Jack swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I owe you an apology. A big one." Ella's expression remained neutral, but she gestured for him to continue. "The way I treated you that day at the mall, and even after, during the training, it was wrong. So wrong." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I saw what I wanted to see, not what was really there." Tears pricked at the corners of Jack's eyes as he continued. "I've caused so much harm. To you, to this community. I didn't want to see it before, but now I can't unsee it." Ella listened quietly, her face softening as Jack spoke. "I'm so sorry, Miss Moore, for everything. For judging you, for arresting you, for the hurtful things I've said." Jack's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I know sorry doesn't fix it, but I want you to know that I truly regret my actions and I want to change. Really change, not just go through the motions." Jack looked down at his feet, unable to meet Ella's gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know how sorry I am, and that I'm committed to doing better." Ella's eyes softened as she listened to Jack's heartfelt apology. She took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as she considered his words. The silence between them stretched for a moment, filled with the weight of their shared history. "Jack," Ella finally said, her voice gentle but firm, "thank you for your apology. I can see that you've been doing a lot of thinking and soul-searching." Jack nodded, still unable to meet her gaze. Ella reached out and placed a hand on his arm, causing him to look up in surprise. "I accept your apology," she said, her eyes shining with compassion, "and I want you to know that I forgive you." Jack's eyes widened, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over his face. "You do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ella nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I do. But Jack, I want you to understand something. True change isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, a journey that takes time and effort." She paused, making sure her words sank in. "You've taken the first step, and that's important. But there will be challenges ahead. There will be times when old habits try to creep back in. The key is to keep moving forward, to keep learning and growing." Jack listened intently, hanging on to every word. He felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a sense of hope blooming in his chest. "I've seen the changes in you during these past weeks," Ella continued. "You've opened your eyes and your heart to new perspectives. That's not easy, and I commend you for it." Tears welled up in Jack's eyes, and this time he didn't try to hide them. "Thank you, Miss Moore. Your forgiveness, it means more than I can say." Ella squeezed his arm gently. "Remember, Jack, this is just the beginning. Keep working on yourself, keep challenging your assumptions, and know that this community is here to support you in that journey." Jack nodded, a mixture of gratitude and determination settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, of closure. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but with Ella's forgiveness and guidance, he knew he had the strength to walk it. As Jack stood there, still processing Ella's forgiveness, she took a deep breath and looked at him with a mixture of kindness and determination. "Jack," Ella said softly, "there's something else I need to tell you." Jack furrowed his brow, unsure of what more could be said. "What is it, Miss Moore?" Ella's eyes seemed to look far away for a moment, as if reaching back into the past. "I knew your family, Jack, many years ago, when you were just a little boy." Jack's eyes widened in surprise. You knew my family?" Ella nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "After your father passed away, your mother was struggling. She was working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet and take care of you at the same time." Jack stood there, stunned into silence. He had vague memories of those difficult times, but he'd never known the full story. "I was working at the community center back then," Ella continued. "Your mother came to us for help. We provided her with food assistance, helped her find better job opportunities, and even watched you sometimes when she needed a break." Tears welled up in Jack's eyes as he listened. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. I had no idea," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ella reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You were too young to remember, Jack, but I never forgot your family. Your mother was so strong, so determined to give you a better life." Jack's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with the beliefs he'd held for so long. He felt a deep sense of shame wash over him, realizing how badly he had misjudged Ella and the community she represented. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Ella's eyes were filled with compassion as she replied, "I wanted you to see the truth for yourself, Jack, to understand the importance of this community and the work we do here." Jack nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of Ella's words. He realized that she had been trying to help him all along, just as she had helped his family years ago. "I want to help you change your life, Jack," Ella said softly. "Just like I helped your mother all those years ago. Will you let me?" Ella's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jack stood there, his heart pounding, as he processed everything she had just told him. The weight of his past actions and the newfound knowledge of Ella's connection to his family left him feeling both humbled and determined. After a moment of silence, Ella spoke again, her voice filled with hope. "Jack, I have a proposition for you. I'm starting a new initiative to bring the police and our community closer together. Would you consider working with me on this?" Jack's eyes widened in surprise. "You want me to work with you after everything I've done?" Ella nodded, a gentle smile on her face. "Yes, Jack. I believe in second chances, and I see the potential for real change in you." Jack felt a surge of emotion. Here was an opportunity to make amends, to truly prove that he was committed to changing his ways. Without hesitation, he nodded eagerly. "Yes, Miss Moore. I'd be honored to help," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ella's smile widened. "That's wonderful, Jack. We'll be working together to create programs that foster understanding between law enforcement and the community. It won't be easy, but I believe it's necessary." Jack nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. "I understand. I want to do whatever I can to make things right." Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into the work with Ella. They spent long hours at the community center, planning workshops and outreach programs. Jack found himself learning more about the community he had once judged so harshly. One afternoon, as they were preparing for their first joint police community workshop, Jack turned to Ella. "I can't thank you enough for this opportunity, Miss Moore. I never thought I'd be doing something like this." Ella smiled warmly at him. "You're doing great, Jack. Your perspective as a police officer is invaluable to this initiative." Jack felt a swell of pride at her words. He was finally using his experience for something positive, something that could make a real difference. As the day of their first workshop approached, Jack felt a mix of nervousness and determination. He knew that facing his fellow officers and the community members he had once treated with disdain would be challenging, but he was ready to take that step, to show everyone that people could change for the better. As Jack and Ella worked side by side, organizing community events and outreach programs, a noticeable shift began to occur. The tension that had once defined their relationship slowly melted away, replaced by a growing sense of mutual respect and understanding. One sunny afternoon, they found themselves setting up for a neighborhood barbecue at the local park. Jack was busy arranging tables when he overheard a group of kids whispering and pointing at him. "Isn't that the mean police officer?" one child asked. Jack's heart sank, but before he could react, Ella stepped in. "That's Officer Wilson," she said kindly. "He's here to help us today. Why don't you kids show him where to put the games?" The children hesitated for a moment, then cautiously approached Jack. He smiled nervously, unsure of how to interact with them. "Hey there," he said softly. "I could use some help with these games. Where do you think we should put them?" To Jack's surprise, the kids eagerly began offering suggestions. As they worked together, their initial wariness faded, replaced by laughter and excited chatter. Jack found himself genuinely enjoying their company, something he never would have imagined possible just a few months ago. Ella watched from a distance, a warm smile on her face. She could see the change in Jack, how he was opening up and connecting with the community in ways he never had before. As the weeks passed, Jack became a familiar face at community events. He helped organize neighborhood watch meetings, participated in youth mentoring programs, and even volunteered at the local food bank. With each interaction, the community's perception of him began to shift. One evening, after a successful town hall meeting where Jack had spoken about the importance of community policing, an elderly woman approached him. "Officer Wilson," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I remember when you first started coming around here, I didn't trust you one bit. But now, well, you've proven me wrong. It's good to have you on our side." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." As he and Ella walked back to their cars that night, Jack turned to her. "You know, Miss Moore, I never thought I'd say this, but I feel like I belong here, like I'm part of something important." Ella nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "You are, Jack. You've become an ally to this community, and that's a beautiful thing to see." Jack smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in his career, he felt truly fulfilled, knowing that he was making a positive difference in people's lives. As the sun began to set on a warm summer evening, Jack and Ella stood side by side, watching the bustling community event they had organized together. The park was filled with laughter, music, and the delicious aroma of grilled food. Families gathered around picnic tables, children played on the grass, and neighbors chatted animatedly with one another. Jack's eyes swept over the scene, taking in every detail. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a feeling of belonging, of pride, and of genuine happiness. He glanced at Ella, who was smiling contentedly as she watched a group of kids playing a game they had set up earlier. "You know, Ella," Jack said softly. "I never thought I'd be standing here like this. Not in a million years." Ella turned to him, her eyes twinkling. "And yet here you are, Officer Wilson. Here you are." Jack nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "I can't help but think about how different things were just a few months ago. How different I was." "You've come a long way," Ella agreed. "But the change was always within you, Jack. You just needed to open your heart to it." As they watched, a young boy ran up to Jack, tugging on his sleeve. "Officer Wilson, can you come play catch with us?" Jack's face lit up with a genuine smile. "Sure thing, buddy. I'll be right there." Before joining the kids, Jack turned back to Ella. "Thank you," he said earnestly, "for everything. For not giving up on me. For showing me a better way." Ella patted his arm gently. "You did the hard work, Jack. You chose to change, to learn, to grow. That's all on you." Jack nodded, feeling a swell of emotion. He looked out at the community he had once viewed with suspicion and disdain. Now he saw friends, neighbors, and people who trusted him. He had become a part of something bigger than himself, something truly meaningful. As he watched the diverse group of people enjoying the event they had created together, Jack realized how much richer his life had become. He had learned to see beyond his prejudices, to connect with people on a human level, and to use his position as a police officer to truly serve and protect his community. With a deep sense of gratitude and purpose, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. He was committed to continuing this journey, to being a better person every day, and to working tirelessly to foster understanding and respect in his community. As he joined the kids for their game of catch, Jack felt truly at peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. If you enjoyed the story of Ella and Jack, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.